Ex-mother-in-law chains and beats sisters in barn, but a lone Sioux Indian hears screams and does something shocking. Imagine for a moment the muffled sound of screams echoing through the old timbers of an abandoned barn. Think about what it must have been like to live in a time when justice depended on the strength of fists, and where love had to break ancestral traditions to exist. What would you do if you heard the despair of two souls being torn apart by hatred? This is a story that will show you how fate can transform the darkest moments into foundations for a revolutionary love. If you've ever felt that some stories need to be told for the world to understand the power of redemption, then subscribe to the channel to receive more narratives like this, where every scar transforms into strength and every tear into a seed for a better future. The morning of 1812 dawned heavy over the frozen lands of South Dakota, carrying with it the smell of moldy hay and the echo of muffled screams that tore through the silence of the abandoned barn. Between the time-worn planks and the rough ropes that cut delicate wrists, Briar and Asta trembled like dry leaves in the wind, their bodies marked by bruises that told stories of relentless fury. Briar, at 23, kept her lips sealed, in a thin line of resistance, her hazel eyes refusing to shed a single tear before the woman who tormented her. Each lash she received on her bare back was absorbed as if she could protect her younger sister through her own pain. Her blonde hair, once styled with vanity, now clung to her sweaty face, mixed with dried blood and dirt. Asta, 3 years younger, still carried in her blue eyes a spark of hope that refused to die. Her small, wounded hands clutched her chest, trying to contain not only the physical pain, but the despair that grew with every poisonous word that came from her ex-mother-in-law's mouth. "Someone will hear us," she whispered between sobs. "Someone will come." The ex-mother-in-law of both, Griselda McKinnon, was a woman in her early 50s whose bitterness had crystallized in her heart like eternal ice. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her small dark eyes gleamed with a cruelty that seemed to feed on the suffering of others. "You corrupted my son with your snake eyes," she shrieked, brandishing the whip made of raw leather, each blow echoing through the barn like dry thunder. For Griselda, the two women who had successively married her only son represented everything she despised: the beauty she had never possessed, the youth she had lost, and especially the influence they exerted over Thane, the weak boy she had raised to be an extension of her own will. When Thane died of fever 3 months earlier, leaving the two widows without protection or inheritance, Griselda saw the perfect opportunity for her revenge. "He died because of you," she screamed, sweat dripping from her forehead as she raised her arm again. "Because of your spells, your sweet lies, my boy was pure before you touched him." The barn, built decades earlier by Griselda's deceased husband, had become the perfect theater for her distorted thirst for justice. Far from the town, hidden among hills covered with bare oak trees, no one could hear the screams of the two women she had held captive for over a week. The wooden structure groaned with the wind, and small beams of sunlight filtered through the cracks, creating golden patterns on the bruised bodies of the sisters. Briar closed her eyes when she heard Griselda's heavy footsteps approaching again. She knew it was her turn to receive the blows, and prepared herself to absorb the pain as she had been doing since waking up in that cursed place. Her back was already a map of open wounds and fresh scars, but her mind remained intact, calculating, planning, waiting for the right moment. "You first, the elder one," Griselda snarled, grabbing Briar's hair with brutal force. "It was you who taught the younger one to be a harlot, wasn't it? It was you who showed her how to steal my sons." "Heart?" The whip cut the air and met Briar's skin with a crack that made Asta scream in despair. But Briar made no sound. Her mind flew beyond those rotten walls, remembering the green fields of her childhood, when she and Asta ran barefoot among the wild daisies, free as birds who had not yet known cages. Asta, tied a few feet away, couldn't tear her eyes from her sister. Every blow Briar received seemed to strike her own heart, and she pulled at the ropes until her wrists bled, in a desperate attempt to free herself and protect the one who had always protected her. "Please," she pleaded in a hoarse voice, "stop." She didn't do anything. We didn't do anything. But Griselda was beyond reason, lost in a labyrinth of hatred and madness that grew stronger each day since her son's death. For her, punishing those women was not just revenge. It was a sacred ritual, a way to purify Thane's memory and restore the order she believed had been disturbed. The wind began to blow harder, making the barn creak like a ship in a storm. Dry leaves danced across the dirt floor, and somewhere in the upper rafters, crows began to caw as if sensing that something was about to happen. It was then, in that moment of absolute despair, that the winds of fate began to blow in the direction of redemption. Almost 3 miles away from the cursed barn, among the ancestral oaks that guarded secrets of past generations, Caelan Thorne moved like a living shadow through the morning forest. His bare feet touched the frozen earth without making a sound, a technique perfected since childhood, when he learned that survival depended more on silence than on strength. At 25, Caelan carried on his sculpted body the marks of a life, lived between two worlds. His sun-bronzed skin contrasted with the pale scars that cut across his chest and arms, permanent reminders of the massacre that had destroyed his family 5 years earlier. His coal-black hair fell to his shoulders, held only by a leather band ornamented with eagle feathers, a symbol of his lineage within the Oglala Lakota tribe. That morning, as on so many others, Caelan followed the tracks of a deer that would lead him away from tribal lands, entering the undefined territory between his world and the world of the white settlers. He was a solitary hunter by choice and necessity, solitary because the ghosts of his dead family still whispered in his ears, necessary because his tribe needed the meat he brought from dangerous hunts. The oak wood bow curved perfectly in. His experienced hands, the sinew string stretched to the exact tension that would allow the arrow to pierce any prey. His dark eyes, deep as night lakes, followed every movement in the brush, every leaf that danced out of the natural rhythm, every sound that didn't belong to the forest's symphony. It was then that the wind shifted. First, it came as just a strange whisper mixed with the creaking of dry branches. Caelan Thorne stopped immediately, all muscles tense as bowstrings, his breath controlled as he sharpened his ears. In the tradition of his people, the spirits spoke through the wind, and he had learned since childhood to distinguish between the voices of nature and supernatural calls. But what reached his ears was no spirit's voice. It was a human scream. Scream of pain, a scream of despair. The arrow prepared for the deer fell silently among the dead leaves. Caelan closed his eyes, concentrating completely on the direction of the sound. His ancestors had developed an almost supernatural ability to locate sounds at great distances, a skill that had become even sharper in him due to years of solitude in the forest. The sound came from the southwest, distant but unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, more than one, and there was something in the quality of those screams that made Caelan's blood heat like lava in his veins. They weren't screams of fright or surprise. They were screams of someone being tortured, of someone who had lost hope but still fought to live. Without hesitation, Caelan began to run. His feet knew every stone, every root, every hidden hole. In that forest, he moved like personalized wind, leaping over fallen logs, ducking under low branches, holding his bow firm in one hand while the other balanced against the trees. His breathing remained controlled even while running, a technique he had learned by observing wolves during their night hunts. As he drew closer, the screams grew clearer, more desperate. Caelan could now distinguish two different voices. One, deeper, controlled even in pain. The other higher-pitched, young, broken by crying. And there was a third voice, older, full of venom and fury, shouting words he didn't fully comprehend but whose malevolent intent was crystalline. The smell arrived before the sight, the smell of fresh blood mixed with old hay and rotting wood. Caelan slowed his pace, now approaching with the caution of a predator assessing the situation before an attack. Through the bare oak branches, he could see the structure of the barn, a crude, abandoned building that looked like an open wound on the landscape. Hidden behind a wide trunk, Caelan observed the scene unfolding before his eyes and felt an ancestral fury awaken in his chest. An elderly woman, with grey hair and a demonic expression, wielded a whip over two feminine figures tied in the gloomy interior of the barn. The victims were semi-naked, their bodies marked by recent and old wounds, their wrists bleeding from the rough ropes. Something deep and primitive awakened within Caelan in that moment. It wasn't just indignation at the cruelty he witnessed, it was recognition. He had lost his family to senseless violence, had seen his mother and sister brutalized before being killed by white soldiers, and now, before his eyes, 2 women suffered the same kind of torture that haunted his nightmares. But this time he could do something. This time he had arrived in time. Kalen tested the tension of his bow, checked the arrows in his quiver, and allowed the ancestral fury of his warrior forefathers to flow through his veins like liquid fire. His dark eyes turned into burning embers, and for the first time in years he didn't feel alone. The spirits of his dead family whispered in his ears, and they all said the same thing. Now. Kalen's attack was not preceded by war cries or threats. It was silent as death and sudden as lightning cutting through the night's darkness. Griselda was raising the whip for another blow when the barn door simply exploded inward. It wasn't opened. It was ripped from its hinges with a force that made the entire structure tremble as if an earthquake had shaken only that cursed piece of land. Kalen's silhouette filled the doorway like a vengeful apparition, his bow drawn and an arrow pointed directly at Griselda's heart. The morning light entering from behind him created a golden halo around him, making him seem more spirit than man, more force of nature than mortal creature. Griselda froze with the whip still raised in the air, her small, cruel eyes widening, in terror at the imposing figure who had burst into her sanctuary of revenge. What are you? She began to stammer, but the words died in her throat when she saw the expression on Kalen's face. There was no negotiation possible in those dark eyes, no mercy, no hesitation. It was the expression of a predator who had found his prey, of a warrior who had chosen his enemy, of a man who had decided that some acts deserve immediate and brutal consequences. "Drop it," Kalen said in broken English, his voice hoarse with suppressed emotion. The word came out as a low growl, charged with an authority that brooked no disobedience. Griselda, however, was far from a woman who was easily intimidated. Decades of bitterness and hatred had transformed her into something almost as savage as it was dangerous. Instead of dropping the whip, she brandished it in Kalen's direction, as if it were a sword. "This is my territory, savage!" she shrieked with the harsh voice of one who had spent years cultivating her own wickedness. "These are my prisoners. Get out of here before I call the soldiers." Kalen's response was to release the arrow. The shaft cut through the air with a deadly whistle and embedded itself in the wooden wall, just 2 inches from Griselda's head. The woman screamed and staggered back, finally understanding that she was facing someone capable of killing her without hesitation. "Next, heart," Kalen said, already preparing a second arrow. His hands didn't tremble, his aim didn't waver. There was a cold certainty in his movements that made it clear he wasn't making empty threats. It was then that Briar, still tied but managing to turn her head, saw for the first time the face of her savior. Even through the pain and despair, that clouded her vision. She could perceive something extraordinary in those features marked by suffering and hardened by survival. It wasn't just his wild beauty that impressed her, but the way he looked at her, not as a broken object worthy of pity, but as a person who deserved to be defended. Just as winds change direction without warning, sometimes fate places people in our path who arrive exactly when we need them most. If you believe there are encounters that are not coincidence but purpose, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories where the improbable becomes inevitable and where every soul finds its true family. Asta had also stopped crying, her blue eyes fixed on the imposing figure who had burst into their world of nightmares like a warrior from ancient legends. There was something in Kalen Thorne's posture, in the way he positioned himself between them and Griselda, that rekindled a hope in her that she had believed dead forever. "You don't understand," Griselda tried one last time, her voice now laden with ill-disguised desperation. "They killed my son. They're witches, seductresses, they deserve to die." Kalen did not reply with words. Instead, he approached Griselda with measured, deliberate steps, his bow still drawn, the arrow still aimed at her heart. With each step he took, the woman retreated until her back touched the barn's rear wall. "You go," he said, his voice low but charged with an authority that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. "Now. Never. Return." Griselda looked at the bound sisters, then at Kalen, and finally understood that she had lost. her reign of terror, her sanctuary of revenge, her opportunity to punish the women she blamed for her son's death. Everything had ended with the arrival of that silent warrior who stared at her as if he could see directly into her rotten soul. "This isn't over," she snarled, spitting on the ground at Kaylin's feet. "They are mine by right. I'll be back with soldiers, with armed men. You'll pay for interfering." Kaylin slowly lowered his bow, but his eyes remained fixed on Griselda with an intensity that made the woman retreat further. "You try," he said with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. Wait." The silent threat was more effective than any scream. Griselda understood in that moment that she was facing someone who not only knew how to kill, but would do so without hesitation if she posed any future threat to the two women he had decided to protect. Without another word, Griselda McKinnon gathered her whip and left the barn with hasty steps, casting hateful glances over her shoulder. Her screams of fury and promises of vengeance echoed through the cold morning as she moved away, but they already sounded hollow, like the barks of a dog that had lost its territory. When the sound of Griselda's footsteps finally disappeared into the distance, a strange, heavy silence descended upon the barn. Kaylin remained motionless for a few moments, ensuring that the threat had truly receded, before finally lowering his bow completely and turning to the two women who had witnessed his intervention. What he saw made his heart clench in his chest, in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The silence that followed Griselda's departure was broken only by the sound of the two sisters' ragged breathing and the soft creaking of the ropes cutting into their wrists. Kaylin remained still for a moment, as if he needed to process the reality of what had just happened, before cautiously approaching Briar. "No, hurt," he said in hesitant English, putting his bow on his back and drawing a small, bone-handled knife from his waist. His hands, which moments before wielded deadly weapons, now trembled slightly as he approached the ropes binding the older woman. Briar looked directly into his eyes when Kaylin knelt beside her. It was the first time in weeks that someone had looked at her as a human being instead of an object of contempt or revenge. There was something in that man's expression, a profound sadness mixed with fierce determination, that made something within her stir, like an ember refusing to die. "Thank you," she whispered hoarsely, trying not to move as he carefully cut the ropes. Each movement of the blade was precise, calculated not to cause further damage to the already wounded skin of her wrists. You saved our lives." Kaylin didn't respond immediately, focused on freeing Briar first, then quickly moving to Asta. The younger one had started crying again, but these were tears of relief and gratitude, no longer of despair. When her hands were finally freed, she tremulously raised them and touched Kaylin's face, as if she needed to confirm that he was real. "You're an angel," Asta murmured, her voice broken by emotion. "An angel sent by God to save us." Kaylin shook, his head slowly, his eyes fixing on the wounds that covered both women's bodies. The fury he had felt watching Griselda torture them was replaced by a different, deeper pain. The pain of recognizing suffering similar to what he had witnessed in the destruction of his own family. "Not angel," he said, rising and offering his hands to help them stand. "Just man who listened." The two sisters leaned on each other as they tried to balance on legs that had been bound for days. Briar noticed how Kaylin respectfully averted his gaze when he realized their clothes were torn and inadequate, and something in that simple gesture of decency made her heart clench in a strange and unexpected way. "We need to go," Briar said, forcing herself to think practically, despite the pain pulsing through her entire body. "She'll come back with other men, like she said. We need to get out of here." Kaylin nodded and began to remove his own leather tunic, offering it to Briar to cover her wounded body. When she hesitated, he insisted with a gentle but firm gesture. "Cold," he explained simply. "Need cover." Asta observed the interaction between her older sister and the man who had saved them, noticing something beginning to form in the air between them, an invisible current of mutual respect and recognition that went beyond the circumstances of the rescue. There was a delicacy in the way Kaylin addressed Briar, and a different attention in the way Briar watched him. "Where do we go?" Asta asked, pulling the rags of her own dress to cover herself better. "We have nowhere to go. We have no family, no money." Caelan Thorne looked at the two women for a long moment, his dark eyes processing not only their words, but the complete situation they found themselves in. He had saved their lives, but now he found himself responsible for them in a way he hadn't anticipated. In the culture of his tribe, once someone saved another person's life, a sacred bond of protection was created that could not be lightly broken. "My home," he said finally, pointing in the direction of the forest. "Safe place. Away from bad woman." Briar and Asta exchanged glances. Going with a stranger to an unknown place would normally be unthinkable, but their options were limited. Griselda had made it clear that she considered them her property, and there was no civil authority in the region that could protect them, from a woman with connections and determination to get her revenge. "Is your home far?" Briar asked, trying to assess if they would be physically able to make a long journey in their current state. "Far for hurt people," Caelan admitted. "But I carry." The offer was simple, direct, with no apparent ulterior motives. Asta looked at Briar, waiting for her older sister to make the decision that would affect both of them. Briar studied Caelan's face, looking for signs of falsity or malice, but found only a raw sincerity that touched her deeply. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Why are you helping us? You don't even know us." Caelan was silent for a moment, his eyes drifting beyond the barn walls, as if he could see ghosts that only he perceived. "Family," he said finally, his voice low and laden with pain. "My family dead, soldiers I killed, I could not save." The simple confession carried an emotional weight that made both sisters immediately understand. He wasn't saving them out of abstract kindness or moral duty. He was saving them because he hadn't been able to save those he loved most. It was his way of seeking redemption for a guilt he carried like a stone in his chest. "But you can save us," Asta said softly, gently touching Caelan's bare arm. "And that means something." Caelan nodded slowly, seeming to find some solace in those words. "Means second chance," he agreed. "For you, for me." Briar made her decision. "We'll go with you," she said, her voice gaining a firmness it hadn't possessed in weeks. "We'll go to your home, your safe place, and we'll find a way to repay your kindness." "Not kindness," Caelan corrected, beginning to gather some less soiled pieces of fabric that could serve to protect the sisters' wounds during the journey. "It's necessary." And so, between the walls of the barn that had been a stage for so much suffering, a silent agreement was made. Three people wounded by fate, each carrying their own scars and losses, decided to unite their journeys in the hope of finding something they had all lost, a place where they could be accepted as they were. The journey through the forest was an odyssey of pain and discovery that tested not only the two sisters' wounded bodies, but also Caelan's silent determination to fulfill his promise of protection. The warrior had improvised a kind of stretcher with flexible branches and his own cape, alternating between carrying Briar and Asta when their strength failed. The first hours were the most difficult. Asta, more physically fragile, faltered every few hundred yards, forcing the group to stop frequently so she could catch her breath. Briar, determined not to be a burden, forced herself to continue even when her legs trembled like leaves in the wind. But Caelan could see in her eyes the constant struggle against the limits of her strength. "Rest," he said for the third time in 2 hours, indicating a moss-covered fallen log. "Water," he added, offering a small leather canteen he carried at his waist. Briar drank first, just a few sips before passing the canteen to Asta. Even in her thirst, she maintained the protective instinct she had always had toward her younger sister. Caelan observed this gesture and felt something stir in his chest. Recognition. It was exactly how he had cared for his own sister before the soldiers took her. "Your sister?" Asta asked between sips of water, noticing the expression that had crossed Caelan's face. "You mentioned family." Caelan was silent for a moment, his eyes lost in the dancing shadows of the forest. "Had sister," he said finally. "Younger like you, always. Protected her." "What happened?" Briar asked softly, recognizing in his voice the same pain she herself carried. Soldiers came to village, looked for gold. Sioux knew where. Gold hidden. Kalen picked up a small stone from the ground and squeezed it between his fingers until his knuckles turned white. Family did not know. Soldiers did not believe. Aster and Briar exchanged glances, both understanding without needing more details. The brutality of the conflicts between settlers and Sioux Indian tribes was known throughout the region, but hearing the personal account of someone who had lost everything made the reality much more visceral and painful. "Were you there?" Briar asked, although a part of her feared the answer. "Was hunting far. When came back." Kalen left the sentence unfinished, but the heavy silence that followed spoke more than any words could express. Aster instinctively reached out and touched Kalen's arm, a simple gesture of comfort that made the man look at her in surprise. He wasn't accustomed to displays of empathy from strangers, especially from people he himself had just saved. "You weren't to blame," she said with the conviction of someone who had lived her own burden of unnecessary guilt. "Just as we weren't to blame for Thane's death. Sometimes horrible things just happen." Briar observed the interaction between her sister and Kalen, seeing how Aster's natural kindness seemed to touch something deep in that man's wounded heart. There was an innocence in Aster that had survived all the cruelties they faced, a capacity to offer solace even when she herself needed healing. "Thane was our husband," Briar explained, feeling she owed him some explanation. "First mine, then Aster's when he thought I couldn't give him children." Kalen frowned, trying to comprehend the family arrangement that seemed strange, even for someone from a different culture. "Same man, you two women?" "Yes," Aster confirmed, her cheeks coloring slightly. "It wasn't for love, it was out of necessity. I needed protection after my parents died, and Briar needed someone who could give Thane what he wanted." Kalen Thorne processed these emotions in silence, beginning to understand not only the circumstances that had led the sisters to that barn, but also the emotional complexity of their situation. Two women who had shared a husband not by choice but by survival now found themselves completely alone in the world. "But it didn't work out," Briar continued, her voice laden with a bitterness she hadn't yet completely overcome. "Thane died of fever before either of us could conceive, and his mother blamed us for everything, for his death, for the lack of heirs, even for the rain that didn't fall. In my tribe," he said slowly, "man can have 2 wives, if can care, for if they agree." Aster and Briar exchanged glances, surprised by this revelation. "And do they agree?" Briar asked, genuinely curious. "Sometimes. When families need. When women alone." Kalen stood and offered his hands to help them continue their journey. "But always, respect always, and choice." His words lingered in the air as they resumed walking, each of the women reflecting on the implications of what had been said. For Briar, who had always resented the forced arrangement with Thane, the idea of choice sounded like an impossible luxury. For Aster, who had accepted her fate with resignation, the notion of mutual respect was a revelation. As they delved deeper into the forest, the landscape began to change. The trees grew taller and older, their trunks covered by thick moss that filtered sunlight into greenish and golden hues. The air became purer, laden with aromas of wild plants and damp earth that contrasted sharply with the smell of mold and despair that permeated the barn. "Are we getting close?" Aster asked, who had refused to be carried for the last hour, determined to do her part of the journey on her own legs. "Close," Kalen confirmed, pointing to an elevation covered with ancient oak trees. "Village and there." But as they approached the tribal territory, Kalen began to show increasing tension. His steps became more cautious, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings as if expecting to be confronted at any moment. "Is something wrong?" Briar asked, noticing the change in his behavior. Kalen stopped and turned to them, his expression serious and worried. "My people, not expect. 2 white women. Could be trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Aster wanted to know, a new wave of anxiety spreading through her chest. "Some hate white. Much hate. Much death." Kalen ran his hand through his hair, clearly conflicted. "But you hurt, need care, need safe place." Briar immediately understood the dilemma Kalen was in. He had promised to protect them, but bringing them to his village could create problems for both them and himself. It was a situation with no easy solutions. "Perhaps we could stay nearby," she suggested. "Somewhere close enough for you to help. Us, but far enough not to cause problems with your tribe." Kalen shook his head. "No, bad woman that can come back with soldiers. You need real protection, protection of tribe." "Then what do we do?" Asta asked, her voice laden with a vulnerability that made Kalen's heart clench. He looked at the two women, one with a face marked by the fierce determination of someone who had learned to fight for survival, the other with the resilient sweetness of someone who refused to let the world harden her heart, and made a decision that would change not only their lives, but the destiny of his own tribe. "I speak with Council of Elders," he said, his voice gaining a determination it hadn't shown before. "Tell stories, show wounds, ask for sacred protection." "What if they say no?" Briar asked. Kalen looked directly into her eyes, and she saw in them a resolution that made her understand he had fully committed to their well-being. "Then I fight for you until last breath." The Oglala Lakota village emerged from the forest like a mirage made of smoke and golden shadows. Conical tipis, built with poles and covered in tanned hide, spread in concentric circles around a large central fire that never went out. The smell of roasted meat and medicinal herbs floated in the air, mixed with the sounds of children playing and women talking as they worked. Kalen stopped at the edge of the clearing, his hands clenching into fists as he observed his own village as if seeing it for the first time. He knew that what he was about to do violated not only ancestral traditions, but would also jeopardize his own position within the tribe. A solitary warrior was already viewed with suspicion. A solitary warrior who brought white women into the village would be considered a traitor by many. "Stay behind me," he instructed in a low voice, his eyes scanning the curious faces that were already beginning to turn in their direction. "Don't speak. Not yet. Let me explain first." Briar and Asta positioned themselves like shadows behind Kalen's imposing figure, both aware of the glances that began to focus on them. There was a mixture of curiosity, hostility, and pure shock in the expressions of the tribal members who saw them arrive. Some of the elder women whispered among themselves in their native tongue, discreetly pointing to the sisters' torn clothes and visible injuries. The first to approach was a fierce-looking young warrior, with ritual scars decorating his chest, and raven feathers braided into his black hair. His dark eyes burned with disapproval as he directed quick, harsh words to Kalen in the Lakota tongue. Briar didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. The young warrior, whom she supposed to be someone important in the tribal hierarchy, gestured violently in their direction, his voice rising with each sentence. Other tribal members began to gather, forming a tense semicircle around the group. Kalen responded in the same language, but his voice remained low and controlled. Briar could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were positioned near the knife at his waist, prepared to defend the women he had promised to protect against any threat, even if that threat came from his own people. "What are they saying?" Asta whispered, instinctively moving closer to Briar when she noticed more warriors joining the discussion. "I don't know," Briar replied in a low voice, "but it doesn't sound friendly." The discussion intensified when an elderly woman emerged from one of the larger teepees, leaning on a staff adorned with bones and feathers. Her completely white hair was braided with leather strands and small stones, and her eyes, though clouded by age, gleamed with sharp intelligence. When she spoke, everyone else fell silent immediately. Her words were directed straight at Kalen Thorne, and even without understanding the language, Briar could feel the weight of authority in the elder's voice. She was clearly someone whose words carried the weight of tribal law, and the expression on her wrinkled face showed no sign of welcome. Kalen knelt before the elderly woman and began to speak in a respectful but firm tone. From time to time, he pointed to Briar's and Asta's visible wounds, and his words became more passionate, more urgent. Briar understood that he was telling the story of the rescue, pleading for their lives before the informal tribunal that had formed around them. The Elder listened in silence, her eyes moving slowly between Kaelin and the two women. When he finished speaking, she approached and began to walk around Briar and Asta, examining them as if they were animals in a market. Her arthritic hands gently touched some of the most visible wounds, and Briar saw an expression of surprise, perhaps even compassion, quickly passed through her eyes. The elder spoke a few words to Kaelin, who nodded gravely before turning to the sisters. "She is Grandmother White Feather, leader of women. She wants see wounds, all." Briar immediately understood what was being asked and felt her face flush with embarrassment. But she looked at Asta, saw the fear in her younger sister's eyes, and made the decision for both of them. "All right," she said, beginning to carefully pull away the pieces of fabric covering her arms and shoulders. What was revealed made several tribal members sharply inhale. The wounds were worse than they had imagined, a cruel map of whip marks, rope burns, and bruises in various stages of healing that told the full story of the torture they had suffered. Some of the younger women of the tribe covered their mouths with their hands, and even some of the tougher warriors averted their gaze. Grandmother White Feather examined each wound with the experienced gaze of someone who had seen much violence over the years. When she finished, she spoke a few words to the gathered crowd, her voice laden with an authority that brooked no argument. A murmur passed through the tribe, and Briar could see that the atmosphere had changed. The initial hostility had not completely disappeared, but it had been tempered by something that looked like respect, compassion. She wasn't sure. "What did she say?" she asked Kaelin when the elder moved away. "She said, 'You suffered like warriors. Wounds. Tell story of courage.'" Kaelin seemed almost surprised by the words he translated. "She said, 'Anyone who survives this deserves protection of tribe.'" Asta began to cry silently, not from pain or fear, but from a relief so profound that it made her tremble. For the first time since Thane's death, someone had looked at them and seen not objects of shame or revenge, but people worthy of protection and care. But the apparent victory was interrupted when the young warrior who had initially confronted Kaelin stepped forward, his voice rising in protest. His words were swift and furious, and Briar could see that he was contesting the elder's decision. "What is he saying now?" she asked, noticing how the tension returned to spread through the crowd. Kaelin hesitated before answering, but finally translated, "He says white women bring trouble. Soldiers can follow. Tribe can suffer because of us." It was a logical argument, and Briar could see in the faces around her that many agreed with the young warrior's concern. She took a step forward, ignoring the surprised looks, and addressed Grandmother White Feather directly. "May I speak?" she asked, her voice firm despite the fear she felt. The elder studied her for a long moment, before nodding slowly. Briar took a deep breath, and looking directly into the clouded but penetrating eyes of the tribal leader, began to speak with a passion that came from the deepest part of her heart. "I don't understand your language," she said, "but I understand pain. I understand loss. I understand what it means to be rejected by people who should love you." Her words were paused to allow Kaelin to translate, but she kept her gaze fixed on the elder. "We didn't ask to be born white. We didn't ask to marry a weak man. We didn't ask to be hated by his mother. But we ask for a chance." She pointed to the wounds on her arms. "These marks were not made by enemies in battle. They were made by a woman who blamed us for things beyond our control. Your warrior," she gestured to Kaelin, "not only saved our lives, he showed us that there are still people in the world who choose to protect instead of destroy." Briar paused, allowing her words to be translated, before continuing with an intensity that made several tribal members lean forward to listen better. "If you allow us to stay, we won't be a burden. We'll work. We'll learn your customs. We'll contribute to your community. And if the soldiers come looking for us," she looked directly at the young warrior who had protested, "then we'll face it together, as a tribe." The silence that followed was so complete that the crackling of the central fire sounded like distant thunder. Grandmother White Feather studied Briar's face for a time that seemed eternal, her ancient eyes searching for signs of falsity or weakness. Finally, she smiled. Grandmother White Feather's smile was like the first ray of sun after an endless storm. She approached Briar, and with her arthritic but surprisingly firm hands, gently touched the older woman's face, her fingers delicately tracing the marks left by the ill treatment. The elder then spoke, her voice laden with an authority that echoed through generations of accumulated wisdom. Kaelin translated her words with an expression of growing surprise. She says, "Your words carry warrior's spirit. That suffering purified you, like fire purifies metal. And that," he hesitated, as if he couldn't believe what he was translating, "that the spirits visited her in a dream 3 nights ago, showing arrival of 2 wounded sisters who would bring important change to tribe." A murmur of admiration and awe swept through the crowd. In the Oglala Lakota culture, Grandmother White Feather's prophetic dreams were considered direct messages from the ancestors, and to contradict them would be equivalent to blasphemy. The young warrior who had protested against the sisters' presence visibly recoiled, his hostile expression replaced by a mixture of surprise and reluctant respect. "You stay," Grandmother Whitefeather announced in broken English, her first words in the sisters' tongue. "Stay, as daughters of tribe. Learn our ways. Teach your ways." Asta collapsed in tears of relief, her legs finally giving way under the emotional weight of the past few days. Briar supported her, but her own eyes were moist as she repeatedly murmured, "Thank you," toward the elder, who had decided their lives with a few simple words. But it was then that Kaelin Thorne stepped forward and did something no one expected. He knelt before Grandmother Whitefeather and began to speak in the Lakota tongue, his words flowing with a passion and urgency that made the entire tribe lean in to listen better. The expressions around them gradually shifted from curiosity to shock, then to something that seemed a mix of admiration and alarm. Some of the older warriors began to whisper among themselves, and several women covered their mouths with their hands in gestures of surprise. "What is he saying?" Briar asked, noticing the growing intensity of the crowd's reaction. Grandmother Whitefeather raised a hand to silence the tribe and directed several quick questions to Kaelin, who responded with the same intensity and conviction. The conversation became a rapid exchange of words that clearly touched upon deeply important community matters. Finally, the elder turned to the sisters and spoke directly to them, her words carefully chosen. "Kaelin asks permission to take you two as wives. Says his heart big enough to love both, that you 3, it can be new family." The silence that followed was so profound, it seemed as if time itself had stopped flowing. Briar and Asta looked at each other, both struggling to process what they had just heard. The proposal was so unexpected, so far outside any possibility, they had imagined that neither could form words. "But this is," Briar began, her voice failing. "Permitted," Grandmother Whitefeather completed firmly. "In our tradition, strong man can care for 2 women if they agree, if he can protect, if can provide, and if," she looked directly at Kaelin, "if love is real, not possession. Love." Kaelin slowly stood and turned to face the 2 women. His dark eyes carried a vulnerability that contrasted sharply with the fierce warrior image he had projected until then. "I not force," he said, his words chosen with extreme care. "I just offer protection, family, place, to belong." Asta was the first to find her voice. You want us as wives. Both of us. I want you safe," Kaelin responded. "Want you happy, if that means wives, yes. If means just protected sisters, also accept." The raw honesty in his words touched something deep in both women's hearts. Here was a man who offered not only physical protection, but also complete emotional acceptance, demanding nothing in return beyond what they were willing to give. "We need to talk," Briar said finally, looking at Asta. "Alone." Grandmother Whitefeather nodded and gestured for the crowd to disperse. "Think," she said. "No hurry. Decision must come from heart." As the tribe moved away, giving the sisters the space needed to deliberate, Kaelin remained for a moment, as if wanting to say something more. But finally, He just nodded respectfully and joined the other warriors around the central fire. Briar and Asta were led to a small teepee on the edge of the village, where they could finally be alone for the first time since the rescue. The interior was simple, but welcoming, with animal hides covering the floor and a small central fire that spread golden light across the wooden walls. "What do you think?" Asta asked as soon as they sat on soft hides near the fire. Briar was silent for a long moment, her hands unconsciously tracing the recent scars on her arms. "I think 3 days ago we were tied in a barn waiting to die," she said finally. "And now a man we barely know is offering to make us his family." "But it's not just that, is it?" Asta said softly. "There's something about him, something in the way he looks at us. It's not how Thane looked. Thane saw us as objects. Kaelin sees us as people." Briar nodded slowly. She had noticed the same thing, the respectful way Kaelin addressed them, how his eyes never lingered inappropriately on their bodies, how he asked permission before touching them, even to help them. "And do you feel something for him?" she asked, studying her sister's face. Asta blushed but found the courage to answer honestly. "I feel gratitude. I feel safe when he's around. And I feel—" She hesitated. "I feel like he's the first man who looks at me and sees who I really am." "And I feel the same," Briar admitted. "But is that enough for a marriage, for a lifetime?" "Was it enough for our marriages to Thane?" Asta responded. "At least this time we would have a choice, and we would have each other." The two sisters sat in silence, each lost in her own thoughts. Outside they could hear the normal sounds of tribal life, children playing, women talking, the steady rhythm of someone beating hide. It was a sound of normalcy, of community, of belonging that neither had experienced in a long time. "There's another thing to consider," Briar said eventually. "If we marry him, we'll become part of this tribe forever. There will be no going back to our previous world." "What previous world?" Asta asked. "The world where we were property of men who didn't love us, where we were blamed for things we couldn't control, where we were tortured by a woman who hated us simply for existing." Asta's words echoed in the small teepee, and Briar understood that her younger sister had articulated something she herself was feeling, but was afraid to admit. They had nothing to lose by returning to the white world, and potentially everything to gain by embracing this new possibility. "So you want to do this?" Briar asked. Asta looked directly into her eyes. "And you?" "I think," Briar said slowly. "I want to try. I want to see if we can build something new, something of our own." And so in the dancing shadows of an indigenous teepee, two women who had lost everything made the decision that would change not only their own lives, but the destiny of an entire tribe. The Oglala Lakota wedding ceremony took place on the following full moon, when the silver disk rose over the forest like an ancestral eye blessing, the most improbable union the tribe had ever witnessed. During the 2 weeks leading up to the ritual, Briar and Asta underwent a transformation that was both physical and spiritual. The women of the tribe, led by Grandmother White Feather, undertook the task of preparing the brides with the seriousness of those conducting a sacred ritual. First came the purifying baths in a nearby stream, where icy mountain waters washed away not only the dirt of ill treatment, but symbolically removed the painful memories of their previous lives. Moonlit Stream, a young Oglala Lakota woman specializing in herbal medicine, meticulously cared for the sisters' wounds. Her ointments made from healing roots and leaves accelerated healing and reduced the most visible marks, although some scars remained as permanent reminders of their journey through suffering. Scars. "Tell story," Moonlit Stream explained in hesitant English as she applied a fragrant green paste to Briar's arms. "Story of survival, story of strength, not shame, pride." It was a perspective that both Briar and Asta were learning to embrace. In the white society from which they came, their wounds would be seen as marks of shame, evidence of their degradation. But in Oglala Lakota culture, each scar was seen as proof that they had faced adversity and emerged victorious. Kaelin Thorne, for his part, spent these 2 weeks preparing differently. He built with his own hands a new teepee, larger than his previous dwelling, with 3 separate sleeping areas connected by a common central space. It was an unprecedented architectural arrangement in the village, reflecting the unique nature of the family being formed. The men of the tribe observed his dedication with a mixture of admiration and perplexity. Working alone on building a house was unheard of. Traditionally, the entire community participated in such projects, but Kalen had insisted on doing everything himself, as if each plank placed, each rope tied, each detail finalized was a personal declaration of commitment to the women he had chosen to protect. "Why not accept help?" asked Fierce Eagle, the young warrior who had initially opposed the presence of the white women in the village. "Because I need to prove," Kalen responded, carefully adjusting a beam into place. "To myself, to them, to tribe, that I can care." On the night before the ceremony, the 3 oldest families of the tribe gathered to discuss the implications of the triple marriage that was about to happen. It was an unprecedented situation that required not only spiritual approval, but also practical guidelines for how it would function within the existing social structure. Wise Raven, the oldest warrior of the tribe, and Grandmother White Feathers, principal counselor, expressed the concerns many silently carried. "If we give white women the place of wives," he said, "what message do we send to our own daughters? That their men can choose outsiders instead of them?" Grandmother White Feather listened patiently before responding with the wisdom she had accumulated over decades leading her people. "Kalen did not choose outsiders instead of our daughters," she said. "He chose to save lives that were being destroyed, and by doing so showed exactly the kind of man we want our daughters to find. Someone who protects the defenseless, who acts with courage when others hesitate." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "Furthermore, these women did not arrive here out of ambition or greed. They arrived wounded, broken, with nothing but pain. If our tribe cannot offer protection and healing to such people, then we have lost something essential of our own soul." On the day of the ceremony, Briar and Aster woke before dawn, their bodies trembling not from cold but from a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that neither had felt since childhood. The gentle sound of drums began to echo through the village as the first lights of day filtered through the trees, creating golden patterns that danced on the walls of their temporary teepee. Moonlit Stream arrived accompanied by 5 other women, each carrying different elements of the preparation ritual. They brought dresses made of deer hide, tanned soft as silk, decorated with colorful beads and feathers that told ancestral stories. Each piece had been sewn specifically for them during the 2 weeks of preparation, a collective work that represented the community's acceptance. "Red for courage," explained one of the elder women, pointing to the red beads that adorned the bodice of Briar's dress. "Blue for wisdom, white for new beginning." Aster's dress followed a similar pattern, but with variations that reflected her gentler personality. More white and blue beads, smaller and more delicate bird feathers. Both dresses were crafted to be beautiful, but also practical, allowing free movement and suitable for the region's climate. While the women prepared the brides on the other side of the village, Kalen was undergoing his own preparation ritual. The men of the tribe had taken him to a sweat lodge, built especially for the occasion, where steam from water poured over heated stones purified not only his body, but also his spirit. 3 women in one home, said Fierce Eagle, who had unexpectedly become one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the marriage after witnessing Kalen's dedication. "How do you intend to keep peace?" Kalen closed his eyes, allowing the warm steam to open his pores and his thoughts. "I not keep peace," he responded. "I create love where true love is peace as comes naturally." "What if they fight among themselves?" asked another warrior. "Women can be complicated. 2 women in one home. They already are family to each other," Kalen interrupted. "They already protect each other, already love each other. I just join this family. I don't replace anything." It was a perspective that revealed not only his emotional maturity, but also his intuitive understanding that the success of their union would depend on respecting and nurturing the bonds that already existed between the sisters, rather than trying to compete with them. And so in the dancing shadows of an indigenous teepee, Two women who had lost everything made the decision that would change not only their own lives, but the destiny of an entire tribe. When the sun reached its zenith, the ceremony officially began. The entire tribe gathered in a large circle around the sacred fire, which had been fed throughout the night with special woods that produced aromatic smoke. The drums increased in intensity, creating a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to synchronize the heartbeats of everyone present. Caelan Thorne was the first to enter the circle, wearing only a leather breechcloth adorned with painted symbols representing his lineage and warrior achievements. His bare chest displayed the scars he had gained in battles and hunts, but also new symbols, painted specifically for the ceremony. Spirals representing growth, intertwined circles symbolizing union. He positioned himself at the center of the circle, facing the direction from which his brides emerged. When Briar and Aster appeared at the edge of the clearing, a murmur of admiration swept through the crowd. The transformation had been complete. Where before there had been broken and desperate women, now walked two figures of beauty and dignity who seemed to have been born for that moment. Grandmother Whitefeather rose from her place of honor and began to speak in the Lakota tongue, her voice carrying the weight of millennia-old traditions. Although Briar and Aster did not understand every word, they could feel the solemnity and importance of the moment. The elder was invoking the ancestral spirits, asking for their blessings for a union that defied conventions, but had been approved by prophetic dreams. Today, Grandmother Whitefeather said, switching to English, 3 souls become one family, not just husband and wives, but sacred circle of mutual protection. She signaled for the 2 women to approach the center of the circle. Briar was the first to move, her steps firm and determined. Aster followed, more hesitant but with increasing determination with each step she took towards the man she had chosen as protector and companion. When the 3 figures were together at the center of the circle, Grandmother Whitefeather began the binding ritual. First, she tied a leather cord around Caelan's right wrist, then extended the cord to tie Briar's left wrist, creating a physical connection between them. Next, a second cord linked Caelan's left wrist to Aster's right wrist. Finally, a third cord was tied, connecting the 2 sisters' free wrists, completing a triangle of cords that symbolized the triple nature of their union. Now, the elder said, you are bound not only by cords, but by promises. Caelan, do you promise to protect and honor these women, to treat them as equals, never to favor one over the other? I promise, Caelan said, his voice strong and clear. Briar, do you promise to accept Caelan as protector and companion, to respect your position as leader of this new family, to work alongside Aster to create harmony? Briar looked into Caelan's eyes, then into her sister's eyes before responding. I promise. Aster, do you promise to accept Caelan as protector and companion, to respect Briar as older sister, to work to create a family based on true love? I promise, Aster said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. Grandmother Whitefeather then took a small pot of red paint made from clay and animal blood and began to paint symbols on the forehead of each of the 3. For Caelan, she drew a circle with 2 crossed lines, representing a man protecting 2 women. For Briar, she painted a crescent moon, symbol of wisdom and female leadership. For Aster, she drew a star, representing hope and a new beginning. Now, drink, she said, offering a wooden bowl containing a dark aromatic liquid. The liquid was bitter and strong, made from herbs that had both medicinal and spiritual properties. Caelan drank first, then passed the bowl to Briar, who drank and passed it to Aster. When the bowl returned empty to the elder's hands, she smiled and raised her arms to the sky. By the heavens, by the earth, by the spirits of the ancestors, I declare you family, she cried, and the entire tribe erupted in shouts of joy and approval. The drums became a symphony of celebration, and tribal members began to dance around the trio still bound by the sacred cords. Food was brought: roasted meat, wild vegetables, dried fruits, breads made from native grains. Fermented drinks were served, and the celebration continued until well after the full moon rose over the treetops. It was only when the crowd began to disperse that the cords were finally cut, symbolizing that the 3 were now united by bonds stronger than any physical cord. Kalin led his new wives to the teepee he had built, carrying a lit torch from the sacred fire to start their own hearth. Fire! When they crossed the threshold for the first time as a family, both Briar and Asta felt something they hadn't experienced in years, the feeling of being home. "It's ours now," Kalin said softly, observing their reactions as they explored the space he had created for them. "Our home, our family, our life." And for the first time since they could remember, the two sisters felt as if they truly belonged somewhere. The first months of marriage were a delicate dance of discovery and adaptation that tested not only the vows they had made, but also the fundamental human nature of three people trying to create something unprecedented. Domestic life in an Oglala Lakota teepee operated by rhythms completely different from those Briar and Asta knew from their previous existence as settler wives. The day began before dawn, when Kalin silently rose to check the traps he had set. Overnight, Briar, who had always been an early riser, quickly adopted the habit of getting up with him, offering to help with tasks that were traditionally masculine. Asta, naturally more inclined to sleep later, took on responsibilities related to home maintenance and meal preparation. "Don't need to get up early," Kalin said to Briar on a particularly cold morning when she followed him to the river's edge to check the fishing nets. "Want to learn," she replied, watching how he tested the tension of the ropes with experienced fingers. "Want to be useful in every way possible." It was this determination to contribute equally that began to define the dynamic of their union. Briar, with her more assertive and analytical nature, naturally gravitated towards activities that required strategic planning, helping Kalin Thorne decide where to hunt, how to distribute resources, when to plant or harvest. Asta, with her intuitive kindness and natural caregiving abilities, became the emotional heart of the family, the one who smoothed tensions, offered solace, and maintained domestic harmony. But not everything was harmonious from the beginning. The first major crisis arrived in the third month, when Briar and Asta had their first serious argument as wives of a shared man. The conflict began over something seemingly trivial, about who should accompany Kalin on a multi-day hunt, but quickly revealed deeper tensions about jealousy, territory, and identity. "I'm the elder," Briar said, her voice charged with an authority she had developed over years protecting her younger sister. "It's natural that I take on more responsibilities, but you've already spent so much time with him in the past few weeks," Asta retorted, a rare display of assertiveness that surprised both. "Sometimes it feels like there's no room for me in this marriage." The argument happened on a warm afternoon, while Kalin was out checking traps, and it escalated until both were yelling things they immediately regretted having said. It was Briar who finally broke the cycle of accusations, breaking down in tears that came from a place much deeper than simple jealousy. "I'm scared," she confessed, her tears making clean trails on her face, dirty from working in the medicinal garden they had started to cultivate. "I'm scared that if I'm not perfect, if I'm not useful enough, he'll reject me like Thane did, like his mother did, like everyone always has." Asta, seeing her older sister vulnerable for the first time in years, immediately abandoned her own anger and knelt beside Briar. "And I'm scared that I'll never be strong like you," she admitted, "that I'll always be the useless younger sister who needs to be protected." It was in that moment of brutal honesty that both understood they weren't truly fighting each other. They were fighting against the ghosts of their past insecurities that they had brought into their new marriage. When Kalin returned that night, Han found his two wives sitting together, comforting each other. He immediately realized that something significant had happened. "Problem?" he asked, approaching cautiously. "We had our first real fight," Briar said, wiping her eyes but not trying to hide the fact that she had been crying. Instead of looking worried or annoyed, Kalin smiled. "Good," he said, confusing both women with his reaction. "Means you feel safe enough to fight. In real home, people fight sometimes." His simple but profound perspective helped them understand that occasional conflicts were not signs of failure in their marriage, but evidence that they were truly building a real family with all the emotional complexities that implied. The resolution came in the form of a new tradition that Kalin suggested. Each week, one of the wives would have special time alone with him, while the other would focus on personal projects or spend time with other women of the tribe. It was an arrangement that honored both their individual needs and their collective commitment. During Briar's special time with Kaylin, they frequently hunted together or explored distant territories, activities that satisfied her desire for adventure and physical challenge. During Asta's time with him, they often worked together in the medicinal garden, or he taught her how to make tools and household utensils, activities that appealed to her more domestic and creative nature. But it was during one of these weekly excursions that the second major challenge of their marriage emerged, this time coming not from within their family, but from outside. Fierce Eagle came running to the teepee one autumn afternoon, his face showing an urgency that made Kaylin immediately grab his weapons. "Soldiers," he said, gasping. "Many soldiers, coming our way, looking for white women." The moment everyone had feared had finally arrived. Griselda McKinnon had fulfilled her threats and returned with military force, determined to reclaim what she considered her personal property. Kaylin looked at his wives, seeing fear spread across their faces, but also seeing something more: determination. In the months since their arrival at the village, both Briar and Asta had transformed. They were no longer the broken and desperate women he had rescued from a barn. They had become integral parts of the Oglala Lakota community, contributing to tribal life in ways that earned respect and admiration. "How many soldiers?" Briar asked, her voice firm, despite the fear she felt. "Maybe 20, Fierce Eagle responded, armed with horses. It was a considerable force against a tribe that had perhaps 12 warriors fit to fight, but Kaylin showed no fear or hesitation. "We prepare," he said simply. "We protect our family." The word "our" referred not only to his wives, but to the entire tribe that had opened their hearts to accept such an improbable family. And as they began preparations for what could become the most important battle of their lives, Briar and Asta understood that they had finally found not only love, but also a cause worth fighting for. The final confrontation did not happen the way anyone had anticipated. The soldiers arrived on a cloudy November morning, their blue uniforms contrasting brutally with the golden and red hues of the autumnal forest. Griselda McKinnon rode beside the captain, her black mourning clothes and her expression hardened by obsession, making her seem more apparition than living woman. But instead of finding an unprepared tribe and 2 terrified women hidden as fugitives, the soldiers encountered something they clearly didn't expect: an organized and determined community, with 2 women who not only refused to hide, but positioned themselves on the front line of their own defense. Briar and Asta emerged from the teepee wearing not the ragged dresses of their previous lives, but the full attire of married Oglala Lakota women. Their hair was braided with feathers and beads, their faces painted with the symbols of their new family, their bodies radiating a confidence and dignity that contrasted dramatically with the broken figures Griselda had left tied up months earlier. "There, they are!" Griselda McKinnon shrieked as she spotted them, pointing with an accusing finger. "My daughters-in-law, stolen by these savages." The captain, a middle-aged man with battle scars on his face, studied the scene before him with experienced eyes. There was something in the posture of the 2 women, in the way they voluntarily positioned themselves between the soldiers and the tribe, that didn't align with the story of kidnapping Griselda had told. "Ladies," he said, with a firm, but not hostile voice, "I am Captain Morrison. This woman alleges you are being held against your will. Is that true?" It was Briar who responded, her voice carrying an authority that made several soldiers instinctively straighten up. "Captain Morrison, my name is Briar, and this is my sister Asta. We are not prisoners here. We are wives by our own free choice, and respected members of this community." "Lies," Griselda interrupted, her voice rising to a hysterical scream. "They've been bewitched, seduced by diabolical magic. Look at them, dressed like savages, painted like heathens." The captain raised a hand to silence Griselda and addressed Asta directly. "And you, young lady, do you confirm what your sister said?" Asta stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried a strength that surprised even Briar. "Captain, 6 months ago I was this woman's property, tortured daily in a rotting barn. Today I am an honored wife, a member of a community that values me, and for the first time in my life I am free to make my own choices. You can see which situation I prefer." A murmur passed through the ranks of the soldiers. Several of them had noticed the still visible scars on the two women's arms, marks that told a story of abuse that completely contradicted Griselda's narrative of innocent, kidnapped victims. It was then that Caelan Thorne approached, and his presence completely changed the dynamic of the confrontation. He didn't come as an aggressive warrior brandishing weapons, but as a confident man accompanied by Grandmother Whitefeather and other tribal leaders. His demeanor radiated natural authority and dignity that forced even the most prejudiced soldiers to recognize they were not dealing with primitive savages. "I am Caelan," he said in carefully pronounced English, "husband of these women by the law of my people and by their free choice. If you doubt, ask them, in front of all." Captain Morrison, realizing that the situation was much more complex than he had been informed, made a decision that demonstrated both his military experience and his personal integrity. "Very well," he said, "I will conduct an inquiry right here in the presence of all parties." What followed was essentially an open-air trial, with the Oglala Lakota tribe, the soldiers, and Griselda serving as jury and witnesses. The captain meticulously questioned both Briar and Asta about their experiences, from their marriages to Thane to their arrival at the village. When the sisters described in graphic detail the abuses they had suffered at Griselda's hands, including the still visible wounds on their bodies, several of the younger soldiers visibly flinched. The story that emerged was not of innocent victims kidnapped by savages, but of refugee women who had found sanctuary and love in an indigenous community. "She's lying," Griselda shrieked when Briar finished describing the days in the barn. "They killed my son. They deserve punishment." "Your son died of fever," Asta said firmly. "We cared for him until the last moment, and when he died you blamed us because you needed someone to blame." The raw, stark truth of Asta's words cut through Griselda's lies and justifications like a sharp blade. Even some of the soldiers who had arrived convinced they were on a rescue mission began to question if they hadn't been manipulated into serving a personal vendetta. It was then that Grandmother Whitefeather stood up and did something extraordinary. She began to speak directly to Captain Morrison in perfectly articulated English, revealing a fluency in the language she had hidden throughout the crisis. "Captain," she said, with the dignity of a queen addressing an equal, "I have led the women of this tribe for over 20 years. I have seen many people come seeking refuge, some Sioux fleeing other tribes, some white escaping violence. We never forced anyone to stay. We never kept prisoners. These two women arrived wounded and desperate. We offered healing and protection. They chose to stay and build a new life. This is our tradition, our honor." The moral authority in her words was undeniable, and Captain Morrison realized he was facing a leader who commanded genuine respect from her community. More importantly, he recognized that the two women in question were clearly not victims, but active and content participants in a life they had consciously chosen. "Madam McKinnon," he said finally, turning to Griselda, "based on the testimony I have heard here, I cannot in good conscience force these women to return with you. They are adults, they have made conscious choices, and they present no evidence of coercion or kidnapping." The expression on Griselda's face shifted through anger, disbelief, and finally a bitter understanding of total defeat. She had lost not only her revenge but also any moral justification for her past actions. "This isn't over," she snarled, but her words sounded empty, desperate. "For you, it is over," Briar said, stepping towards the woman who had caused so much suffering. "You lost your power over us the moment we chose a new life. You can try to pursue us for the rest of your life, but we will never again be your victims." The soldiers departed that afternoon, taking with them a defeated and furious Griselda McKinnon. But before leaving, Captain Morrison approached Caelan and extended his hand in a gesture of respect. "You have a strong family," he said. "Take good care of them." "Always," Caelan responded, shaking the officer's hand firmly. 5 years later, the Oglala Lakota village had grown and prospered in ways no one could have foreseen, The presence of Briar and Asta had brought not only cultural stability through their bridge between two worlds, but also practical contributions that improved everyone's lives. Briar had become a recognized leader in hunting decisions and defensive strategy, her analytical skills perfectly complementing the traditional wisdom of the Oglala Lakota warriors. Asta had revolutionized the tribe's herbal medicine practices, combining knowledge she brought from her previous life with indigenous healing traditions. More importantly, both had become mothers. Briar gave birth to 2 children, a boy who inherited Kaylin Thorne's piercing dark eyes and a girl with her own blonde hair. Asta had a daughter whose blue eyes shone with the same kindness as her mother. The 3 children grew up as true siblings, knowing no distinction between the 2 mothers who loved them equally, or questioning the normalcy of their unconventional family. To them, having 2 mothers and 1 father was simply the natural order of the world. On a golden spring afternoon, as she watched her children playing in the center of the village under the affectionate gaze of the entire community, Briar reflected on the extraordinary journey that had led her from that cursed barn to this moment of complete peace. "Do you regret it?" Asta asked, joining her in watching the children. Briar looked at her sister, then at Kaylin, who approached carrying firewood for the hearth fire, then at the thriving village that had become their true home. "Our previous life? Never," she said. "That pain? Sometimes. But then I remember that without that pain we would never have found this." Kaylin dropped the firewood and wrapped both his wives in his arms, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "Pain brought you to me," he said, "but love kept you." As the sun set over the forest that had witnessed their transformation from victims to survivors, from strangers to family, from refugees to respected leaders, the 3 remained embraced, surrounded by the children who represented not only their future, but the living proof that even the darkest beginnings can lead to the brightest endings. In the abandoned barn miles away, now covered in vines and inhabited only by owls and squirrels, wildflowers had bloomed among the rotting planks. Nature had reclaimed the place where suffering once reigned, transforming it into something beautiful, just as 3 wounded hearts had found healing in each other, transforming pain into love, despair into hope, and loneliness into a family that defied all conventions, but was blessed by their own courage to exist. And just as the 3 souls in this story found their redemption through unexpected love, perhaps you too have people in your life who arrived in the darkest moments to become your greatest light. If this narrative touched your heart, leave your like, share in the comments which part moved you the most, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories where courage transforms destinies and true love always finds a way. Until the next journey.